So yeah, anyway, sorry for the abrupt way the class ended this morning. For some reason, my computer shut down and it didn't feel like worth all the time to try to get it restarted and try to do class. So anyway, the good news is that actually, if the computer was going to shut down, it actually shut down at a very nice breaking point for us. So we can actually kind of easily pick up to where we were before the computer shut down. And we want to talk about, if you remember this morning, we were talking about inequality, right? And we talked basically this morning about the data of inequality, right? How the world is, or at least the US, is becoming more unequal. How there are some good things, such as an improvement of the global poor, but for the most part, we have a lot growing inequality over time. And so this afternoon, I want to talk about two questions. The first is, why is inequality growing? Okay, why? What's causing this, right? Can we pin it down? And then the second thing that we're going to talk about is, well, why do we matter? Why does it matter, right? Why are we worried about it, right? Do we have to worry about it? And so those are really going to be the two questions that we talk about this afternoon. Before I jump into those two questions, though, I just want to talk a little bit about what's going on tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will take your third quiz. And your third quiz is going to be on Chapter 9, which is economic growth, basically what we talked about Monday and what we talked about this morning. And then it will be on inequality, which is what we talked about this morning and what we talk about this afternoon. Okay, so that's what's going to be on your quiz tomorrow. And so we will take that at the end of morning class as usual. Okay, so just want to make sure that everybody is clear about the quiz that's going on. Also, I want to give you a heads up about what we're going to talk about tomorrow. So tomorrow and Friday, we're going to be discussing Chapter 12, which is on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And, probably tomorrow's material is as important as any single day's material that we talk about in this class, right? As we're going to talk, we're going to change gears a little bit tomorrow. We're going to begin to talk more about how economies behave in the short run, and begin talking more about monetary policy, fiscal policy, why output goes up, why it goes down, why we have recessions. And to do that, we have to have a model of how the economy works. And so that's what the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is. And so much of what we talk about tomorrow or introduce tomorrow is really going to be the foundation for a lot of what we talk about for the rest of the class. So just want you to make sure you have a heads up that tomorrow's lecture or tomorrow's class is just very important for us. And so, I would highly recommend that you read the chapter before tomorrow's discussion, that you read it after tomorrow's discussion, right? And the sooner that you kind of get a good foundation of the material that's in Chapter 12, excuse me, the better you'll be set up for the rest of the block, right? Because believe it or not, we're really getting close to the halfway point. And so, so a lot of what we talk about tomorrow is important. So just want to make sure that you get a heads up that in addition to preparing for the quiz, spend a little bit of extra time tonight making sure that you prepare for tomorrow's lecture, all right? Tomorrow's class. Okay, so let's talk about economic inequality, right? I should be burning some incense or something to see if this connects. And of course, it's not connecting again. I'm going to lose my mind. Why is this not connecting? I swear to God, it was working earlier. I swear to God. Glad to see you're enjoying this, Mitch. Come on. Hey, ta-da. Okay, here we go. So this morning we talked about the data, right? We talked about the data of inequality. So let's move on to the next big question, which is, what is driving rising economic inequality? What is driving rising economic inequality, right? Can we say something about what exactly is causing this, right? Why is it that we see such a rise in the number of extremely rich, but we really see most of the bottom half of the US income distribution not keeping up? So let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about that. And nothing's working right here. I have some notes that I was going to refer to, and now I realize that they're all screwed up. All right, so I'm going to talk about a number of reasons, right? And all of these matter, right? It's not like any of these are alone mattering. They're all playing a role, right? So these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, some of them are quite related to each other, right? But one of the big reasons that's driving this is what economists call skills-based technological change. And the race between technology and education. Skills-based technological change and the race between technology and education. Okay, there is a race that's going on between technology and education. You were actually asked about this on the exam that you took yesterday. So you were asked in the labor market, what's going on in the labor market, particularly for the college educated? And the question is, why are wages rising? And the reason why wages are rising is because even though there is an increase in the supply of college educated, what's gone up even more? The demand for college educated. Because technology today is extremely education intensive. Okay, technology is increasingly education intensive. Now, this has not always been the case, right? This has not always been the case. If you think back to history, by the way, can I interrupt? Is my video okay? It looks very choppy to me. Is it my video decent for you all? Hello? You get it, some nods?
It's fine.
Fine, okay, thank you. It's just looking very choppy to me, so I want to just make sure you're okay. So in the past, you think about some of the great inventions, like the internal combustion engine. You didn't have to have a lot of education to use an internal combustion engine. Or how about something like sanitation, advances in sanitation? That was something that benefited everybody, right? A lot of past technologies, you didn't have to have a college education to take advantage of. But nowadays, where's a lot of technology taking place? In information handling, in communications technology, and things like big data, or also things such as biochemistry. All of these things, to really take advantage of it, you need a very, very high level of education. And so unlike past technologies that tended to rise all boats, this technology tends to just primarily benefit people who do college educated kind of jobs, right? So for instance, if you're a janitor, your job hasn't changed much over the last 40 years. If you're a college professor, your job has changed a great deal over the last 40 years. And so that's the way that our economy works. As a result, it has really increased the demand for college education. Now, why have wages gone up though? It's important to note that wages haven't just gone up because demand has gone up. It's also because supply is not going up fast enough. In other words, There's a race between technology and education, and who's winning it? Technology. The demand for technology, the demand for college education is outpacing the supply of college educated workers. And so what's happening? Wages are going up for those workers, but they're not going up for other workers. So just look at some data here that kind of, I think, nicely illustrates this problem. This is from your book. This is looking at changes in wages for full-time male workers, okay? So just looking at male workers, what's happened to wages here since 1964? And look at how the disparity between those who have less than a high school education and those who have more than a bachelor's degree has increased over time, okay? So if we look back in 1964, we see that there wasn't really a huge difference between high school educated and college educated workers. But now we see that those who have less than a high school education make about half as much as those who have a bachelor's degree or more, right? And so this has contributed a great deal to inequality, is if you have the skill sets in this modern economy, then you are doing very well. You are doing very well. If you don't have the skill sets, your income is basically flat or even declining. And that has created a lot of economic inequality, right? That has created a lot of economic inequality. Now, related to this, I'm going to call this a second reason, but in some sense, it's very, very closely related to the first, is that there's an increasing importance to what economists call intangible capital. And by intangible capital, I mean capital that you can't touch, but which is capital nonetheless. What is intangible capital? They're tools that you can't really touch, like ideas, or the existence of organizations, or supply chains, or information databases, or software, or training procedures. All right, I could keep on going on and on and on. But they're essentially things that you touch, that you can't touch, but which are tools nonetheless. If you think about how the world has changed, we increasingly live in a weightless world. And what I mean by that is increasingly physical things don't matter nearly as much as the intangible things. So you used to think about, when you talk about physical capital or capital, you think about, well, building a factory. Nowadays, you might think about research and development or patents as the real thing that gives value to a firm, right? Think about, just as one example that might connect to your life, think about Starbucks. Starbucks is really just an idea. Yes, they do have some physical capital, right? They have some buildings. They have some espresso machines. But in general, what does Starbucks sell? It sells you an experience, right? It sells you an experience that's associated with training and an ability to provide some continuity between different stores, to have supply chains where they can provide quality coffee. They can organize this. Even a business like Starbucks, even though it sells you something that is physical, is really more about the intangible capital, right? It is very much more about intangible capital. It's so much different than, you know, the economy of 20, 30 years ago that was heavily manufacturing, right? So as we've moved to this service-based economy, we have just this much different way of production. And so how has this led to inequality? Well, once again, this is capital that takes an education to leverage. Right? Big data, once again, hasn't changed the nature of a janitor's job. Big data has not changed the nature of somebody who's working on a, you know, a supply line at Ford, a production line at Ford. But if you are somebody who works in marketing, big data has completely changed your job, right? To the extent that you work in the world of ideas and services, your job has changed a lot. But who works in those jobs? They're primarily people that have an education, right? So once again, this idea that the nature of capital has changed has benefited some people, but it hasn't benefited everybody, right? It hasn't benefited everybody. The third thing, once again, very much along the lines of the first two, is globalization. Where does US have comparative advantage? Human capital intensive goods. These are the jobs that have tended to benefit and to see their wages grow. The US does not have comparative advantage in labor intensive jobs. The fact that, well, let me back up. We know, hopefully we understand this from all these comparative advantage problems that we've talked about. Comparative advantage is not about who can produce more. It is about specializing in what you do best. So the fact that the US is so good at human capital intensive jobs means that they're going to be relatively horrible at labor intensive jobs. And so these are the jobs that tend to get outsourced. And what jobs get insourced? The human capital intensive jobs. Once again, who does this benefit? Those who have an education. And who does it tend to hurt? Those who don't have much of an education, right? It's very similar to the other changes in our economy, right? That tend to benefit those that have an education or those who have special skills and not benefit those who don't. And so, you know, this is part of that elephant curve that I showed you this morning, right? Why have the poor, the global poor benefited? In part because the global poor can have comparative advantage in labor intensive jobs. They've been able to do well with this, right? Globalization has tended to help the global poor, and it's also tended to help the upper income workers in the US. But who's got squeezed by globalization is the people in the middle largely, right? So while overall globalization is a good thing, it does create winners and losers. And a lot of those losers have been the same people that have lost because they can't take advantage of other technological changes in the US economy. Which leads us to the fourth thing, which once again is closely related to the first three, but just a little bit different. And we can call this reason the economics of superstars. What about that top 1% or even that top 0.01% that's making about more than $10 million a year? What in the world is going on with these people? Because they are getting a huge share of global growth. Well, the answer is when you take technology and you add it to globalization, what do you get? You have a huge increase in the demand for people who have unique skills. We can call those unique skills the superstars. So let me give you an example. I don't know if any of you are old movie fans, but Humphrey Bogart, right? Hopefully you've all seen Casablanca, right? That's a classic movie. Humphrey Bogart, in real terms, meaning adjusted for inflation, never made more than $100,000 for a movie. Tom Cruise now gets paid about $30 million for a movie. What in the world has happened? Is Tom Cruise that much better than Humphrey Bogart? No. But what's happened? Well, the thing is, the nature of the movie industry has changed because of technology and globalization. It's changed because of technology, because now making a movie is not just about going to the movie theater. It's also about selling the streaming rights, selling the YouTube video clips, selling t-shirts, selling Happy Meals, selling this movie in China and in Europe and the rest of the world, right? So technology has changed it, but globalization has changed it in that we have a more globalized market. As a result, is Tom Cruise worth $30 million? I hate to say it, but yes, because what's going to be true about a movie with Tom Cruise in it? People will go see it. They'll go stream it. They'll go buy t-shirts. They'll watch it in China. And so what technology and globalization together have done is they've increased this demand for unique skills, right? Listen, it's a lot different being LeBron James than it was Babe Ruth, right? Babe Ruth was an all-time superstar, but quite honestly, the way that the world existed in 1929 didn't make Babe Ruth nearly as valuable as LeBron James is today, because LeBron James can, leverage this into, people in the NBA are watched in China, they're watched in Europe. They can sell, LeBron James because they have TV shows on HBO. I don't know if you saw this yesterday. This is not even something I realized was a thing, but people are now buying the rights to highlight clips that they can show on the internet. Every time you watch a highlight clip on an internet, somebody actually owns that. So there was a clip of LeBron James dunking on somebody that got sold for $3 million the other day. And LeBron James gets a portion of that, right? This has never existed before. It didn't exist in a world without technology and globalization. And so, what this has done is this, who is this group that's making more than $10 million? Quite honestly, it falls into really one of four categories, or five. It's sports, entertainment, CEOs, meaning the operators of large corporations, law, and finance. It's in those big five categories that almost all of these people are. And so they're essentially superstars, right? They're superstars. Another way to use another analogy to help you understand this, you almost have to think about it as like winning a gold medal versus winning a silver medal. What's the value to winning a silver medal? A minuscule part of winning a gold medal, right? For instance, in the 100-yard dash, to be the fastest person in the world means a lot of money and endorsements. What about being the second fastest person in the world? Nobody knows your name, even though you might be a millisecond slower than that first person, right? To be the superstar, to be the best, pays handsomely. And that's increasingly what we see going on in the US, right? And globally, right? The superstars are really making these astronomical amounts of money. Okay. There is very little doubt, to me, there's very little doubt that one of the things that's contributing to this is that there is a vicious circle between wealth and power. That when you have wealth, you can leverage that into power. And when you have power, you can then leverage that into more wealth. And that is increasingly what we see, particularly when we look at our politics. Who plays the biggest role in setting our public policy? The rich. Right? The rich do. If we go back to that top 0.01%, that top 0.01%, these are the people making more than $10 million. They paid for about half of the campaign last year. That small number of people paid for half of the campaign spending. So it just tells you, right, that they are shaping politics, right? And there's just I don't feel like I need to belabor this point. If you take a politics class, you'll talk about this endlessly, but there's just no doubt that our politics is increasingly being skewed by those who have wealth. And so it is changing policy in ways that benefit the rich and don't necessarily benefit the rest. And it's also leading to polarization. Where politics increasingly is about the rich getting theirs and everybody else can just kind of screw off, to be quite blunt about it. Just to pick one of many examples. Here's a graph that is from your, this is in your reading. But this is looking at the average tax rate of the top 1% versus the bottom 50%. And what have we seen here since the 1950s? What's going up to the average, what's happening to the average tax rate on the bottom 58? The bottom 50%, it's going up. And what's happening to the average tax rate of that top 1%? It's going down. And that's despite the fact that income is flat for that bottom 50%, and income is rising quite rapidly for the top 1%. How do we explain this? It's politics, right? Politics is increasingly controlled by those who have wealth, because wealth creates power in our system, right? And it's one of the dysfunctional institutions that the US has, and that money plays an outsized role in our political system. And so, increasingly it's being co-opted by people that have power, right? And that in general, that's money. And so, yeah, I mean, I just don't think there's any more clear way to say it, that part of this is a result of policy, that our policies are really contributing to income inequality as opposed to diminishing it like it used to. If we look back in the 1950s, you can see quite a big difference between the average tax rate that was paid by the rich and the poor. Most of that difference has disappeared now, right? And that is definitely contributing to income inequality. Okay, now I want to move on to blaming you and blaming me, right? When I say blaming you, I'm really blaming me too, because there's another factor here that plays a role, and that is who we tend to marry, right?
Can you scroll up really quick?
I didn't hear you. What do you say?
Could you scroll up really quick?
Okay. Okay. Assortive mating, right? There's kind of a funny name for it. But what is assortive mating? Assortive mating is the fact that now the wealthy and the educated, who do they tend to marry? They tend to marry the wealthy and the educated. And vice versa. Those who are poorer, and have less education, who are they likely to marry? Somebody also who is poor and has less education. So our households have essentially become assorted into dual income households with two highly paid professionals, or households in which maybe both work, maybe only one of the partners work, and they get paid very little, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is not the way that it's always been. If we went back to the 1950s in a world where most women did not work in the labor force, there was much less correlation between the education levels of partners, right? Much lower correlation. But as women entered the labor force, what has happened increasingly is that men and women tend to seek partners that look a lot like them, right? In terms of their educational levels and also in terms of their income backgrounds, right? So interestingly enough today, if you look at the correlation between the wealth of people who get married, the correlation between the wealth of people who get married is 0.4, which is similar to the correlation between a kid's height and a parent's height. So, there's just a lot of correlation between who we marry. And so what this does is that this has really led to an increase in the number of highly paid households, right, with two people working, and less paid households, right, with one, maybe one, right? It also has played an important role in inequality in a different way. And this has to do with child rearing, the raising of children, because one of the things we see is that there are much different ways that children are raised in highly educated households than in less educated households. So let me just quickly give you some facts. A woman without a college degree is 5 times more likely to be an unpartnered mother, right? Someone without a college degree is 5 times more likely to be a single mother. Mothers that don't have college degrees spend more time working, and as a result, they spend less time with their children, about 30 minutes less a day that an unpartnered woman's mother spends with their children than with a partnered woman. High income, high educated parents talk with their children 3 more hours a week than less educated, lower income families. We could just go on and on and on. I'm not going to belabor the point with lots of data. But what we see is that when parents have a higher education and higher income, what do they tend to do? They tend to take much more intensive child rearing, right? And as a result, these children are more prepared for school. And so unfortunately, what we see is that really how well a kid does in school is largely already determined by the time they enter school. All right, as sad as that is, that if you look at how kids do on tests when they enter kindergarten, where they rank in the percentiles, that is just about a perfect predictor of where you're going to be and in 12 years when you graduate from college, or I'm sorry, when you graduate from high school, right? That in many ways, high school is not reducing, or school is not reducing inequality. It's just contributing, right? It's just continuing the inequality that exists from the ways that children were born. And that's a very sad thing, right? That is a very sad thing. Because what it means is that, once again, for many people, their lives are in some sense predetermined. They're predetermined by where you're born, and then they're predetermined by who you're born to. And so that means that a lot of people with a lot of potential aren't able to maximize it because they're trapped in where they were born and who they were born to. And we as a society are just simply not dealing with this, right? We're simply not dealing with this. And so that leads to the last question here. Why does inequality matter? Right? Why does inequality matter? Why, as citizens of this country or citizens of the world, should we be interested in inequality? If we take this from a selfish perspective, we might be saying, based on who we are in this class, well, listen, we're all likely to have a college education and to get a good job and to be part of that top 10%. This works for me, right? This is good for me. Fantastic, right? And that's probably true for most of us. But that doesn't mean that we should not be worried about economic inequality, because it does impact all of us. And so I want to talk about why that is. And the first reason is to remind us all that productivity is not individual. It is communal, meaning none of us determine how productive we are by ourselves, right? We are all part of a village. Our productivity is based on networks, who we work with. The thing about dealing with people is that we leak and match. The ideas that we have leak and match. We help each other when we have creative ideas, because my creative idea can be picked up by somebody else and built upon. Or in working together, we make something better than what each of us individually could have made. And so what happens in a world of inequality is that you lose a lot of people out of these networks. There are people out there who, if given the opportunity, could join these networks and make us all better off. But in fact, they're not. To say this another way, many people are trapped in a poverty trap. And what a poverty trap is basically you can't escape it because the people around you can't help you escape. Okay, so think about it this way. Think about if you are born in West Virginia, right? Small town West Virginia, one of the poorest places in the country. And you decide that you want to stay in West Virginia. You want to live in West Virginia. If you decide you want to live in West Virginia, for you, what's the value of a college education? To be honest with you, it's not much, because there's not very many college educated jobs in West Virginia. If you decide you want to stay in West Virginia, you don't have much reason to get a college education. If you get a college education, you're probably going to leave West Virginia and use it. That's the poverty trap, right? The trap is that if you're going to stay there, you're essentially going to be surrounded by people in which are not going to allow you to maximize the value of your education, right? And so, that's a big problem, right? And this gets to what we talked about a few minutes ago. Well, yeah, I'll come back to this in a minute. But, well, actually, I'll talk about it now. Look at this graph. This graph is a graph of what we call intergenerational mobility. What in the world is intergenerational mobility? It's really looking at the correlation of a kid's income to a parent's income. A kid's income to a parent's income. So the more highly correlated your income is, then that means there's less mobility, right? Because your income as a kid is largely determined by your income as a parent. So the red areas here are the areas that have less mobility, and the white areas are the areas that have high mobility. So one of the things you'll notice here is that Iowa actually does really, really well. Iowa is amongst the most mobile states in the country, which is great. And part of that is Iowa has a relatively good educational system, right? That helps with income mobility. But look at other parts of the US. You will not be surprised that some of the poorest parts of the US are also do some of the worst in terms of intergenerational mobility, right? Particularly the South. And so, this is just the way that you can be in a poverty trap, because how productive you are is based upon who you are with, right? It's not you alone that determines how productive you are. It's largely who you're with. And so the fact that so many people are stuck in a poverty trap ends up costing us all, because they can't help us all get richer, right? They essentially just get dropped out. That's a big reason. That's a big reason. Another big reason why inequality matters is because fairness matters. Fairness actually matters in economics. And this is actually a kind of growing area of research. But there is a lot of psychology, a lot of psychological research that suggests that people are happier when they feel their lives are fair. And that if you feel inferior, no amount of money is going to make you feel better. So for instance, people feel better about their economic lots in life if they have lower income, but their income is closer to their neighbors. People actually feel worse when their income is higher, but is less than their neighbors. And that kind of sounds bad, but when you think about it more deeply, it makes sense. For most people, it's relative income that matters. So in other words, it's not just about being poor. It's also being much poorer than the people around you. And a lot of this leads to conflict, because when people feel like they're not treated fairly, then they tend to be combative. There's a recent study that came out, one of my favorite recent studies that I've read, that was looking at air rage, right? We all know what air rage is, right? People losing their temper on airplanes. And interestingly, what this study showed is that people who have to walk through first class have a significantly higher chance of experiencing road or air rage when they fly, right? So in other words, to back this up, the study looked at different kinds of airplanes. In some airplanes, you enter in the back. In other airplanes, you enter in the front and have to walk through first class. And what did they show? The more likely you were to walk through the front, the more likely you were to experience an air rage incident, right? Just being reminded that people are better than you tends to piss us off. And it tends to lead to conflict-prone behavior. And I don't think I need to draw the connection between our current politics and this, right? The fact that many people feel disrespected in part because they see the rich getting theirs and everybody else not is a lot of what has led to our current, non-functional political system. Another example of this at work, this is kind of fun to talk about, is something called the ultimatum game. I don't know if any of you have played the ultimatum game, probably not, but this is kind of a fun little economic experiment. And if we were all together in person, I might actually play this game. But here's how the ultimatum game works. It's played between two people, player one and player two. And so for player one, you give them something like $10 or 10 jelly beans, whatever it is. Let's say $10. What player one then has to do is they have to offer some of that money to player two. They can pick how much they want to offer to player two. Then what does player two do? Player two says, I accept that offer, in which the player one gives you the money, or player two says, no deal, and nobody gets anything. Okay, do we understand the rules of the game? So, player one makes an offer of some part of the $10. Player two then says no deal or deal. If it's no deal, nobody gets anything. Okay, how would a rational economist, if you were player one, how much should you offer to player two? What's the best offer?
Half.
Ethan, you say half. You're a nice guy, Ethan. You're a very nice guy. You're not nearly cold-hearted enough to be an economist. What's the most rational offer that player one should make to player two?
$1.
$1, still generous. Give him a penny. Right? Player two should say yes to this, correct? Because 1 penny is still better than nothing. So as an economist, you would say, well, if you are perfectly rational, player one says, I'll give you a penny, and player two says, well, a penny is better than nothing, I take it, and then that's how the game is played. But when you play it with real people, what do we see among the real people? What happens if you would offer player two a penny? What's player two going to say?
I probably wouldn't take it.
Yeah, I'm not going to take it. In other words, I'm going to punish me in order to punish you. Why? Because it's not fair. It's not fair. And that is part of our experience as human beings, right? We believe in fairness. And that doesn't mean that it has to be 50-50. In fact, people are willing to take less than 50-50, but they will not take offers that they think are less than fair. And in other words, they're saying, I'm willing to suffer to punish you, right? I'm willing to suffer to punish you for not being fair to me. And it just goes to show you that fairness matters to people, right? Fairness matters. And so in so many ways, right, you can think about society, the seams of society breaking down a little bit as we see everything becoming less fair. As more and more people are angry, bitter, resentful, not cooperative in ways that we used to, because we see that things are not fair. And so then how is that impacting our economics? It's impacting our institutions. It's impacting our institutions, and as a result, it's threatening economic growth. We are getting less and less fair institutions that encourage productive behavior as opposed to destructive, that encouraging taking as opposed to making, right? In so many ways. We are increasingly seeing a country in which there's a lot of what's essentially corruption. A nicer word for it is opportunity hoarding, meaning the rich are keeping the good opportunities for themselves and not sharing with everybody. Okay? So think about the most selective colleges and universities in the United States. The most selective colleges and universities. If you are in the richest 20%, you are 17 times more likely to get into one of those schools, right? If you are in the richest 20%, you're 17 more times more likely to get into a highly selective college or university. Why is this? In part because they're expensive. You have to have the money. But also in part because, you know, what do rich parents do? They send them to cello lessons and soccer camps and give them tutoring, make sure they get prepared for the SAT, and all these other things that are essentially, in some sense, barriers to entry for poor children. And so this is essentially, it's related to a sort of mating, but it's really saying that it's a large part of our economy just simply isn't working, right? For people that don't have advantages, right? Because they simply don't have access to these elite schools. And it's these elite schools where a lot of the top 1% are coming from, right? A lot of the top 1% is because they got to these elite schools and get part of these elite networks and get their first job with some big Wall Street firm, and there you go, right? Before you know it, you're a captain of industry. You may not necessarily be smarter than anybody else, but you had the connections. And that's, increasingly, that's the way that the world works, right? It worsens education, right? Which is related to this idea of opportunity hoarding. Increasingly, inequality is closely related to outright discrimination. This can be income discrimination, meaning we stereotype poor people. It could be gender discrimination. We know that women tend to be less wealthy than men. They get discriminated against. And it can be discrimination based on race, right? When you look at the economic data on discrimination, you cannot argue based on the facts that discrimination doesn't exist in the US, because it does exist, right? And there is so much evidence of this, right? Some of the most interesting evidence is just evidence that looks at particular behaviors, right? Experiments that economists have done to really test to what extent people are discriminatory in their behavior. So for instance, just to kind of pick a couple of studies that kind of always jump to the front of my mind. A team of economists a couple of years ago did a experiment in which they took a bunch of resumes and sent them out for jobs. But on some of the resumes, they put white names. And then on other resumes, they put African American names. And what did they find? The same resume, but with a white name, got 50% more callbacks, even from employers who claim to be equal opportunity employers. Right? They've done the same experiments when it's come to actors, when they've come to buying cars, right? Where they've trained actors to like go out and try to buy a car. And what you see is that the white actor has to pay less than the black actor trying to buy a car. We know this happens in criminal justice. A lot of income inequality between races in the US is driven by our criminal justice system, where people who look blacker, right? And by this basically meaning skin color, are judged by people to be more guilty, right? So they've done experiments where people that have darker skin color are actually judged by independent observers to be more guilty with the same set of facts. That those who are blacker receive 7 to 8 months longer in jail than those who are whiter, right? There's been studies that show that among women and men, if you have tryouts for orchestra, that women are much more likely to make orchestras when they have blind auditions behind curtains than when they have auditions in which the judges can see who's playing, right? It just goes on and on and on about discrimination. And in part, discrimination causes inequality, but then it's also worsened by inequality because inequality leads to conflict, and it tends to lead to an us versus them thinking, right? And so, you know, unfortunately, there's just this vicious cycle between more discrimination, more inequality, more discrimination. Okay. Inequality tends to worsen trust. We don't trust people as much in unequal societies. The Nobel Prize winning economist Kenneth Arrow said, it can be plausibly argued that much of economic backwardness in the world can be explained by a lack of mutual confidence. When I don't trust you and you don't trust me, then it's hard to trade. And if you can't trade, then you can't get richer, right? You have to think about trust as kind of like the lubricant of life. Right? It makes everything easier, right? I can buy something online and I don't have to worry about if someone's cheating me. I can go to the store and buy a loaf of bread and not worry that there's a rat poison in it, right? I mean, in so many ways, we walk around kind of trusting each other, and that makes life better. And it leads to better institutions in which people engage in productive behavior. But what happens when you don't trust people? Then you think it's a lot easier to fall into the us versus them. And when you fall into the us versus them, what you're really saying is it increases the taking and it reduces the making, right? When it's us versus you, it's a lot more acceptable for me to get rich by taking from you. And so once again, I don't want to just kind of overwhelm you with statistics and studies, but there's so many studies that have shown that when inequality goes up, you tend to get things like more crime, less cooperation, worse government policy, more unemployment, right? Less economic growth, because trust is actually one of the really important parts of good institutions is that people trust each other. And then inequality tends to worsen how democracies work. And as a result, we get a lot less dysfunctional policy. This is just, I think, hard to argue against this. I mean, listen, this has been, as long as we've had democracy, there's been one thing that people agree upon. Democracy works best when you have a strong middle class, right? When you don't have a lot of rich and a lot of poor, but you have a more general equality of conditions. The Greek historian Plutarch, when talking about Athenian democracy, said, an imbalance between the rich and the poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all democracies. Having an imbalance between the rich and the poor. And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that what happens when the rich get too much power, you can gradually move from a democracy in which the general public controls things, to an oligarchy, right? Oligarchy is when a small number of people run things, right? There's one political philosopher, I forget to remember what his name is, but he said, when the rich steal from the poor, it's always slow and legal. And what that means is the rich tend to steal from the poor, not by illegal activities, but by making their activities legal. And how do they make their activities legal? By controlling government, by controlling power. And so, without getting into any specifics, you can think of a lot of the things that have gone on the last few years as just having more dysfunctional democracy, more dysfunctional government, as we simply can't agree to help out people in the middle class and the lower class, right? That so much policy seems to be really driven by a smaller and smaller number of elites. And part of this is the way that we fund our political systems, and part of this is social media, and part of this is a whole bunch of other things, So anyway, as with most things in this class, for every one of these things I've talked about, there's so much more that could be said. But I did want to kind of open up your minds and open up your ears to thinking about some of the big dangers about economic inequality, because I view this as very much a fundamental, something that fundamentally threatens our country and economic growth, right? I mean, in many ways, this is increasingly the fundamental economic issue of our day. And so once again, I just want to kind of remind you here at the end why exactly inequality matters and why you should be concerned about this. First off, because productivity is communal. We all rely on each other. Second, because fairness matters, right? We work better in societies where there's at least some sense of fairness. Fairness doesn't mean equity. It doesn't mean everybody gets the same thing, but at least there's some sense that, you're not screwed from the offset. And then finally, we should be worried because there's reason to think that inequality is impacting our institutions. And so this really reduces our ability to grow in the future, right? And so it's a fundamental threat to economic growth, in my opinion. And so, there's many things we could talk about. One of the things that we don't really have time to talk about is what do we do about it? And, it's hard because a lot of these things, there's not easy solutions. So for instance, what do we do about the fact that technology is essentially making educated people richer, but not helping everybody else? Do we stop technology? I don't think that's a solution. So what do we do about the fact that wealthier people are marrying wealthier people? Should we make educated, wealthy people marry less educated, poor people? No, that doesn't sound like a good solution, right? Should we have our government policy more directly involved in income distribution? That I think is probably reasonable, right? Without getting into the details, I think there's ways of doing that. But yeah, without really having a lot of time talking about the solutions, at least hopefully in our discussion today, you understand the problem a little bit better. So, okay, does anybody have any questions about any of that before I let you go? So once again, remember tomorrow, quiz number 3. And then also remember that chapter number 12 is the important chapter. So make sure you spend some time preparing for class tomorrow, okay? All right, everybody, have a good one. We'll see you tomorrow.